I suppose lots of people watching this or listening to this will be thinking, this is crazy. I want to die. I don't want to live forever. What would you say to them?
You know, when you're in your 30s and hopefully healthy, it's easy to be like, oh yes, one day I'll be finished with life and ready to pass on. My guess is that that's more a feeling that we have to protect ourselves from our fear of mortality than it is one that is genuinely held by most people who are approaching their deaths.
As a sequence of events, human existence is quite simple. You're born, you live, and then sadly, you die. Some people, however, think that could be subject to change, that it's technologically contingent, which means in the future, technologies may arrive which allow us to, in theory, become immortal. But what would that really mean? How would we get there? What technologies are necessary to significantly extend human lifespan? Today's guest is a neuroscientist. He's the author of this fantastic book, The Future Loves You, which talks about the possibility, the science, the practicality of whole brain emulation. Ariel Zeleznikow-Johnston, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks for having me.
I am really looking forward to this conversation. I hope you don't mind me saying this. The book you've written is on a rather outlandish subject. I know you don't think that. The Future Loves You, which is really about humans superseding mortality itself. How and why we should abolish death. I really, really enjoyed it. Before we get to the really complex stuff about brain uploads and connectomes, a really simple question. Why, as a species, does Homo sapiens appear to have this hard limit of around 100 years when it comes to lifespan?
It's essentially because we are optimized for about 70 years of lifespan as being the best trade-off between how quickly we can get to reproductive age and how likely we are to be killed by things in our environment. So that's a complicated, but it helps to understand by looking at some other species other than just humans. So mice, for example, live about 1 year on average, and they reach reproductive age very quickly within, I think, a few weeks or maybe a couple of months of being born. But they, unfortunately, are very, very easy to kill. Snakes eat them, cats eat them, all sorts of things in their environment eat them. So they live fast and die young. On the other hand, we have creatures like whales, which can live, some whales, 200, almost 300 years. And the reason they can do so is they're optimized to live very long lifespans, and they can then slow down their reproduction as a result of that. They can take their time reaching reproductive age in their teenage years because nothing can really kill a giant whale. And this is the trade-off that happens at a genetic level as a result of these forces. There's a trade-off between optimizing for reproductive speed, getting there as quickly as possible, but as a result of getting there so fast, not optimizing a species, the cells within a particular animal for actually lasting a long time. Or on the other hand, you can optimize for longevity, but the trade-off is you have to slow down reproduction.
So it's a good hard and fast rule of zoology that if an animal can reproduce at an early age, it's also going to die at an early age.
Yes. In fact, it's even been shown experimentally in a couple of different ways. So there's one example, I think some possums got isolated off the coast of Virginia on an island where they lost their natural predators. And because they were less likely to be killed by things in their environment, they started to live longer and they started to enter into reproductive age later in life. And indeed, scientists have even done this experimentally, where if you take lab animals and you artificially increase their rate of predation, a scientist goes around killing flies in a test tube, or if they slow it down and they make it artificially safer for them, their lifespans will increase or shorten, and their age to first reproduction will increase or shorten as well. So it's a pretty much a common rule across zoology.
So if humans were around in our present form, physiologically, which that's questionable, for thousands of years, obviously because there are no apex predators above us anymore, we're generally living longer, just purely as an outgrowth of evolutionary adaptation, then we would start to be reproducing possibly later, not because of social circumstances, which is happening anyway, because we'd be living longer? Is that the sort of expectation?
Yeah, so in the absence of technology and culture, which is a huge thing to put to the side, but yes, that is the case, where if we live in a safer environment, we would tend towards longer environments and entering into reproduction later. And indeed, if you look at our great ape cousins, chimpanzees, orangutans, they have lifespans, even in captivity, that are notably shorter than Homo sapiens' lifespans. And that's likely what was the case for our last common ancestor with our fellow great apes as well. So it's been in the hundreds of thousands to past few million years that human lifespans have increased from the 40 to 60 years of our ape cousins to the lifespans that we have today, presumably because we did things like remove predators and better care for each other.
That's so cool. So because we have, these thumbs, opposable thumbs, and we can do all sorts of things that they can't, over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, we get that extra couple of decades.
Yeah, the idea is that we have thousands of genes within us. They're optimizing for trying to keep us alive and also trying to keep us reproducing as best as we can. And there's all sorts of like little trade-offs that are made. Each time there's a mutation, each time there's an alteration, it presents a trade-off between entering reproduction a little earlier, optimizing for getting that as quick as possible, or optimizing for living as long as possible, and maybe at the cost of not entering reproduction quite so quickly. And as we've had safer and safer environments, we've just made the trade-off at a genetic level a little more towards pushing for longevity.
Big Orange. Made out of 50% recycled plastic with a lifetime guarantee. Buying this Big Orange bottle helps support journalism at Novara Media, with 15% of profits also going to Refuigi, a charity that supports refugees in Glasgow and across Scotland. This isn't just any orange Nalgene water bottle that supports independent journalism. It's Novara Media's orange Nalgene water bottle that supports independent journalism. To buy one, go to shop.novaramedia.com.
There's an anecdote in the book which I find really interesting, which is about Huntington's disease, which is this genetically inherited condition. It's a single nucleotide of DNA, which is a horrific condition if you have it. You basically, after about 40, you start to see impairments with regards to fine motor coordination, slurred words, etc., and about 60, you're probably looking at the end. And you make this incredible point in the book, which I've never encountered before, which is actually having Huntington's in a world where median life expectancy is 40 may have actually have been an advantage. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so what you're getting at is, and what we've been talking about but we haven't formally named, is the phenomenon of antagonistic pleiotropy. So to break that down, pleiotropy means affecting multiple traits. And the reason why that's relevant in genetics and often talked about in genetics is because it's very rare for one gene to only affect like one trait, like height or immune function. Most commonly, genes affect all sorts of different traits. So like the gene OCA2 affects your skin color and your eye color and also your sleep. And different variants of genes present different trade-offs between all sorts of different things, where maybe, for example, if you have darker skin, you're more resistant to UV damage, but you need more vitamin D. This also happens with disease-related functions as well. And Huntington's disease, the gene that causes it, HTT, mutations to that, it seems, if you look at the epidemiological evidence, to present a trade-off between, I think it's slightly decreasing perhaps rate of cancer when you're younger and maybe increasing fertility slightly when an individual is younger.
Crazy.
At a cost to leading to the disease that happens, the neurodegenerative disease, later on in life. And as you've noted, this was perhaps less tragic in earlier times when life expectancy was shorter, but is increasingly tragic today. But what's notable is that probably this doesn't exist just for things like Huntington's disease. All sorts of diseases are probably a result of these antagonistic pleiotropy forces, these trade-offs between, increasing fitness when we're younger at a cost to doing damage when we're older.
Yeah, I hadn't read that formulation in the book, but that's fascinating because it's something you see with bodybuilders or people involved in the fitness industry. They will engage in what's called hypertrophy, for 20, 30 years of their life, that generally seems to mean they have a shorter life expectancy. And that people that live in a calorie deficit, as we understand it, over long periods of time, they tend to live longer.
I should note the calorie deficit one I think has become controversial
really?
recently. I think some of the data has shown that it works well in animals that live shorter durations. So in like C. elegans worms, you get dramatic increases. In mice, you get increases of life expectancy. But the data seems to only be clear of animals with shorter lived lives in the first place. And the longer the animal lives for, the less clear the evidence is. I think for humans, there might even be some recent evidence that actually calorie restriction is not good for you.
What's your view on it? Because we're going to talk about aging and death, and people watching this. I'm not getting any younger. I want to live a bit longer. What's your view on the on calorie restriction as a means to living longer?
I mean, I think it's very important for general health to have a good diet and a balanced diet, and not to have an excessive calories all the time. But my understanding is that calorie deficits probably don't increase lifespans for humans, and may actually be bad for humans.
And what do you think about this idea of autophagy and fasting and cellular renewal, and again, that being a pathway to slightly extending life expectancy?
That is the point where I would bow out, because I'm a neuroscientist and I've looked into brain preservation, but the technical details of like every single different possible treatment for extending natural biological lives is a little bit beyond what I'm being entirely on top of. And the reason for that is like there's just so much work being done in this. There's so many different topics, and biology is so complicated. Like there's so many different processes. There's so many different things going on. So it's really hard to know about all the different ideas. But in general, I think the problem is because humans are optimized for this 80-year lifespan, it's very hard for like single simple interventions to dramatically increase lifespans, because otherwise they probably would have already happened. Unless perhaps you can come up with something that, reduces our reproductive fitness, and that's why it wasn't selected for already.
Well, we need to get you back in the UK. 'Cause you're in Melbourne, Australia, aren't you?
That's right.
We'll get you back in the UK with, have you heard of Dr. David Sinclair?
Oh, yeah, I know.
We can get you both in the room, and you can talk about this stuff, because it's quite a different approach. And it's important to say this. We are going to be talking about neuroscience and the human brain, and the relationship between that and oneself, and the idea of prolonging oneself beyond 80 or 100 years. He's in a very different field. Your book, which is remarkably well written, I must say. You're 31.
Thank you.
You're 31?
That's correct.
The subject matter is unusual, I think, for somebody of that age, but for the book to have been written so well, with so many great historical vignettes, it's superb. I mean,
it took a lot of work, but thank you.
I bet it did. No, I bet it did, because to have that kind of detail and those kinds of little intellectual excursions peppered throughout the book makes it a real pleasure, but that's not easy. You talk about Elizabeth Hughes.
Yes.
At the top of the book. Who was she? What was her story? And why is she important?
So I talk about Elizabeth because I think when you're talking about weird ideas like brain preservation, the far future, it's easy for it to all sound like very strange and like impossibly far away. And I think it's helpful to look backwards in history, to look at previous times where things that seemed impossible or science fiction became at some point real. Because as normal as our current time feels to us today, it's very abnormal compared to historically earlier times. So Elizabeth was, in 1919, she was an 11-year-old girl who was diagnosed with what was then called juvenile diabetes, but what we today refer to as type 1 diabetes. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, when she was diagnosed on the basis of becoming increasingly sick and losing weight and thirsty, her diagnosis came with a prognosis of living maybe 6 months to a year, but no longer than that. Because in 1919, there was no treatment for diabetes, and children just died shortly thereafter. Understandably, Elizabeth's parents were very unhappy about this, as I'm sure Elizabeth was herself as well, and they went looking for anything that could possibly be done to extend her life. Now, unfortunately, insulin hadn't been discovered as of yet, so they were unable to procure insulin as a treatment for her. But what had been recently discovered was that if you took diabetic children and paradoxically you restricted their calories, they would last considerably longer than they otherwise would. They would live longer on these starvation therapies than when they were just eating naturally. So I guess that's a circumstance where restricting calories can be useful. And the reason for this is because in diabetes, the problem is too much sugar in the blood, which leads to problems. And through starvation, you can reduce the negative side effects of sugar in the blood. So Elizabeth lived in a sort of a hospital for a few years on this starvation therapy where she was severely underweight. She had very low energy. She lived a relatively low quality of life as a result. But because she lived here for 3 years, she made it to 1921 when insulin was discovered and people first started to have access to it. And as a result, she didn't just last 6 months to 12 months. She didn't last 3 years. She ended up living into her 70s, which was entirely unprecedented in history for a diabetic child prior to that point. And I think it's a really good example to start my book off with. One, because it's sort of, she goes through this limbo state, which is analogous to the brain preservation that I talk about in the book. But it's also relevant because it gives an example of precedent of someone living just long enough to have access to treatments which enable them to live much longer as a result.
It's such an amazing story. And it was when I read that excerpt and I thought, wow, this is a really interesting book. This is this is stuff I haven't read about before, and it's triggering patterns of thinking which aren't familiar to me. And, there was another point right at the start of the book where you say, if you're reading this book, however old you are, you probably would have been dead by now had you been born before the 20th century. Again, such a powerful reframe about the world we live in. And look, we are always talking about the interface of politics, economics, culture, and we can talk about very, depressing stories quite a lot of the time, often very negative stories, negative individuals. But the reality is, the story of the last 150 years when it comes to human life expectancy, lifespan, quality of life is just utterly extraordinary. And what you're saying is with that anecdote, but also with the book more generally, is that what would a repeat of the last 150 years look like if we go again? And when I think in those terms, I think of my grandmother, who was born in 1926. She was born, I think, a year after Hitler's let out of prison, I think. She lived through the Second World War, the collapse of European empires. When she's born, the British Empire is a quarter of the planet's surface, and she died 2 years ago. So if you think about all the things she saw, the jet engine, genome being sequenced, et cetera, then this stuff seems quite plausible. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. Is that the sort of battle you're having to make quite a lot of the time, just to break down people's innate intellectual resistance to this stuff?
Yeah, that is essentially the idea. And that's why I lean so heavy on trying to find what seem like really weird historical precedents where things that seem normal today became normal, but historically were not at all normal. And I'm sure we'll talk about some more of those little vignettes, but that is the idea of what I've been trying to push with the book. I mean, I just totally agree where there are so many serious problems today, like global conflicts, like income inequality and poverty that's still ongoing, things like climate change. And these are really bad things that as a species and as a society, we need to be working to address. But at the same time, I think it's very easy to look at all the problems that exist and become nihilistic and despairing, when I think that a bit of perspective on what's happened historically can give one optimism that things that are terrible with effort can be overcome, at least in some circumstances.
This is a slight deviation, but why do you think our cultural moment is so heavily inflected by negativity? Given all of this, given everything you just said.
I should make clear, I'm not a sociologist, anthropologist, but my guess is just that humans intrinsically have a negativity bias, that we share more negative stories, we're more focused on things that make us anxious and things that we're scared about. And as some folk evolutionary psychology, that would make sense to me because obviously we need to be worried about the things that can harm us and that can hurt us. So my guess is it's just a bias where instead of focusing on things like the fact that millions of people fewer die from malaria, that we've had recent malaria vaccines that are looking promising, or that people have been pulled out of poverty, that drifts into the background and we stay more attuned to the problems that still need to be solved. That would be my guess as to what's going on.
It's so true, about the good news thing, for instance. We've talked about one health condition, which is about a single errant nucleotide of DNA, or not necessarily errant, maybe that's not the right framing.
I should just point out for clarity that in Huntington's, it's a repeat of nucleotides that becomes a problem, as opposed to a single one.
But isn't it in the genetic coding, it's a single nucleotide?
Not exactly. In Huntington's disease, the problem is the number of repeats of a triplet of nucleotides.
Interesting.
Where typically someone, I think, has like 15 to 20 of them, and in Huntington's it gets longer, so you end up having these 30, 35, 40
and the proteins start to misfold as a result.
Yeah, that's right.
So sickle cell anemia, is that one nucleotide?
I think so. Yes.
Good. I know something. That's good.
Quite a few are. We call them monogenic disorders. Yes. There's quite a few of them.
Parkinson's?
Parkinson's, we're not entirely sure, and many dementias, we're not really sure what causes them. There are some that are caused by these sorts of fairly simple genetic changes. So it really depends.
Beta thalassemia?
I think that's probably also a monogenic one.
I think it is.
Yeah.
But on the sickle cell point, and we're talking about good news, there are treatments now for people with sickle cell anemia, cellular therapies, gene therapies rather, which seem to be working.
Yeah. And
you don't hear about it because it's a good news story. I never hear about it. No, this is amazing.
Yeah, it's crazy. Another one that I talk about towards the end of the book is the development of something that's fascinating. It's chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy, or CART therapy for cancer, it's crazy. How it works is you have someone who has, unfortunately, something like leukemia. So they have replicating cells in their blood that are replicating out of control. And to a large degree, people with leukemia can be treated with traditional chemotherapies. But unfortunately, in some circumstances, that fails. And after the first few treatments that are tried fail, historically, the outcomes did not look particularly good for those patient populations. But what has become available recently is a new therapy where you can take some immune cells out of a patient's blood, you can genetically re-engineer them so that they are specifically tailored for targeting the particular kind of cancer that the patient has. And then you can reintroduce them into the patient's bloodstream. And suddenly it's as though their immune systems become unblinded to the fact that there's cancer there and can wipe it out. But it's crazy that it's this novel genetic engineering, new fancy tech that is so far beyond what medicine used to be able to do.
And is that using CRISPR-Cas9?
I don't know. It probably wasn't historically, but they would be using it these days.
The whole gene editing.
Yes.
Again, that's another thing. And I just think most people aren't necessarily that familiar with how advanced this stuff is becoming and how quickly.
Yeah.
And how we are really on the precipice of quite extraordinary breakthroughs with regards to gene therapies and, even gene sequencing. You think about cancer, people can now sequence your blood and they can search for a cancerous tumor. You don't need necessarily an invasive procedure. Just extraordinary. By getting some of your blood, you can find the genome of a cancerous tumor in that person's body. Amazing story,
Yeah.
Good news, you'd think, but you barely ever hear about it.
Yeah, I agree. It's a shame.
Well, that's why we're talking with you today. Let's talk about aging.
Okay.
What is it?
So aging is the increasing dysfunction and damage that occurs to an animal over as time goes on. So over the days, the weeks, the months, the years, things start to break down within an organism's body, whether that's the accumulation of plaque in their arteries, whether it's the weakness in their muscles, whether it's the sagging of skin. It's just the collective increase of dysfunction that occurs to an animal. And
that's it?
That's a very short answer, but...
An aggregate of dysfunctions.
Yeah, it's the increasing dysfunction that occurs. But that's a simple answer, but it's complicated in that it's not really one thing. And that's what makes treating aging so difficult. To bring it back to before, I was talking about how we live the lifespans that we do because we're optimized for living that lifespan based on what presents the best trade-off between reproduction and being able to stay around for longer periods of time. Aging is essentially the observing the downside of that process, insofar as when you make those trade-offs and when the things start to go wrong, that were traded off against for improving reproductive fitness earlier on in life, we start to see those processes go wrong, and we start to see them accumulate. So as an example, I mean, cancer, as we've been talking about, is an obvious one, where you see things like people get skin cancer and colorectal cancer, these cancers of the parts of our bodies that tend to refresh themselves quite frequently. So you don't really hear about teeth cancer, for example, because teeth just, they're pretty much there forever once they've grown. But you hear about colon cancer, skin cancer, because those cells are constantly refreshing and renewing themselves. And there's a trade-off between the ease with which they do that and the chance that something can go wrong during that process. And the increase in the risk of developing cancer over time is presumably because as those cells continue along and as they're optimized to continue replacing themselves, there's just a chance that at some point they do that badly and then they start replicating out of control. And that increasing probability of things going wrong, I guess, is as much aging as wrinkles or anything else that we think of as aging.
I've never heard that before. I've never, ever heard that before. So liver cancer, quite common, of course, that's an outgrowth of a liver's capacity to
regenerate itself and replace itself over time. Yes.
Apart from teeth, what else don't do that in our body?
The lens of your eye doesn't replace itself. The DNA inside your neurons doesn't replace itself. So you've probably heard of brain cancers, but brain cancers tend to be from the support cells to brain cells and neurons rather than the actual neurons themselves so much. I should be careful with that. I'm not an oncologist, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. I think it's most parts of your body are replacing themselves, but it's just those few examples that show that if they're not doing it, you don't get cancer there.
That's seriously cool. And what about these organisms which allegedly don't age? So, sponges are often pointed to as one example of an organism which doesn't exhibit the processes you're talking about, or actually some crustaceans as well, like lobsters, for instance.
I don't know about the lobsters. The sponges one, I think, is kind of cheating.
Okay.
Because in the same sense that, they revert to a simpler organism that then refreshes itself, and then they go back down to being fewer cells again, and then they enlarge. They are, in that sense, able to continue living indefinitely. But if we're allowing that to count, like this just renewal of small groups of cells or individual cells, in a sense, then, like, you could say that humans are immortal because, there's a continuous line of cells that connects me to my my ancestors from millions of years ago, from sperm to egg to embryo to new human. It's not really capturing what we care about when it comes to humans, which is those creatures don't hold on to their memories. They don't have brains to hold on to personalities and life experiences. It's a much simpler sense in which they are immortal.
Can I ask you a question about Elon Musk? He's the man of the moment.
Sure, I'll try my best.
Yeah. It's about neuroprostheses. You talk about this in the book briefly, and you mentioned Neuralink sort of once or twice. Is this going to be a growth industry? Is this something that right now is a bit of a meme? People mock it. He's killing all these primates and all these tests, but actually there's a really robust industry of the future there.
Yes, essentially, so brain implants, or more formally neuroprostheses, the idea of being able to implant something into a person's nervous system to provide them some function that they've lost. So maybe somebody who's had a spinal cord injury and lost control of their limbs, giving them control of those limbs again, or perhaps even one day providing new functions that people don't currently have. And obviously, it's come to the attention of the news with things like Neuralink, but it's actually been something that's been pursued for a lot longer and by many more companies than just Neuralink. And these devices are getting better and better. So I detail a few of the recent advancements in brain implants in the book. Things like devices that restore blood pressure control to people who've had damage to their spinal cord. Examples of devices that are implanted into parts of people's brains that have enabled them to help treat their like Parkinson's symptoms, their tremors, for example, or even there's circumstances where people were unconscious for years due to some fairly severe brain damage, but then through the result of having these implants, they were able to be at least partially restored to consciousness. So I would say it's not just Neuralink and Elon Musk. There's lots of groups working on these brain implants, and they are going to continue to get better and better. The same way that things like cardiovascular implants and other implants for also things like orthopedics have improved over time. It is something that will continue.
Could they reverse things like dementia? Because obviously that already in the UK, for instance, Alzheimer's is the leading cause of death, and that's the future for affluent countries. This is a sign of success is that people die of cognitive decline. Could that be something of a game changer in that field?
I am unfortunately more pessimistic on the idea of being able to reverse dementia with brain implants. There's a few different issues there. The first is we're still not entirely sure what actually causes things like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. But what we do see is a gradual loss of first like synaptic connections, so the connections between neurons, and then the death of the neurons themselves. And the issue there is as that damage occurs, the memories that exist in those connections are increasingly being lost and lost. And in order to restore those functions, you would have to have held on to the synaptic information, those memories in some format. That's quite different from an example where, for example, someone has a spinal cord injury where, their limbs are still there at the other end of the spinal cord. The problem is just that the wire's been broken and needs to be bridged somehow. For a brain implant to treat dementia, you'd have to be able to restore someone's memories to them, which is a much harder ask. Now, I shouldn't be entirely pessimistic because there is some evidence that one of the things that happens in dementia is that it becomes harder to retrieve memories rather than the memories themselves are necessarily lost. And I know there are groups who are working on implants that could help with that sort of issue. So maybe even if it's not possible to entirely prevent dementia or totally fix it with brain implants, there are still devices that could be useful for ameliorating its symptoms in the short to medium stages of it. But yeah, as a fully long-term solution, I'm a little more pessimistic.
So we've talked about what aging is. What is death? The big question.
So what exactly death is something that has changed a little bit over history. So historically, prior to the middle of the 20th century, people died when they stopped breathing and their heart stopped beating, because at that point, there was nothing that could be done for an individual. However, in the middle of the 20th century, we started to develop new devices like ventilators, which can help people breathe even if they're having problems with their lungs, or things like cardiopulmonary bypass machines, which help circulate blood even if somebody's heart has stopped temporarily. And as a result of the development of these new techniques, doctors and legislators and ethicists realized that they had to come up with a more sophisticated definition of what it means for a person to die. In the 1980s in the US, there was the introduction of what's called the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which is a piece of legislation that defines people as dead based on either one, irreversible cessation of all heart and lung functions, or two, irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain. And that law is then interpreted by doctors when defining people as dead. So essentially, today, in most places, a person is dead when a doctor says their brain has irreversibly stopped functioning. The question, though, is what exactly does it mean for something to have irreversibly stopped? Because as medical technology improves, that line gets shifted further and further. So historically, before there were ventilators and cardiopulmonary bypass machines, somebody's brain and body irreversibly stopped functioning basically as soon as they stopped breathing and their heart stopped beating. Whereas nowadays we have all sorts of devices. And when we look to the future, we can imagine that this technology will continue to improve and will also improve as it has for heart and lung functions to also being able to restore lost brain functions. And so I and other philosophers have argued that a more up-to-date definition of what death should be is the absolute theoretical limit of when you have irreversibly lost what makes a person who they are, or when a person's personal identity is lost. Their memories, their personality, their goals and desires, all of the structures in their brain that make them them. So that is what I think the definition of death is the irreversible loss of personal identity.
And the tension here is, of course, you're talking about the self, which relates to the thinking self, and the death of the thinking self is distinct to the physical processes of the body outside the brain. So, for instance, we talk about brain death and whatnot. You have this marvelous image talking about death as we typically understand it, brain death, but then one's memories can exist for up to 36 hours after we might consider somebody to be dead.
Yeah, so I think it seems strange to even ask the question of what is death, because it seems like it's very concrete. I think most people don't think that it's really a question that could be up for debate. But when you start looking at different technologies that exist or medical procedures that are used these days, it does become a little blurrier what the definition of death is. And I think one particular surgical procedure really brings this to light. So there's a procedure called deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. That's a mouthful. But the idea is that you can take an individual and you might have a circumstance where you need to operate on the blood vessels around their heart or the blood vessels in their brain. And for that individual, you can't actually allow their blood to continue to flow while you're doing this surgery. So you can't just use a cardiopulmonary bypass machine, for example. Instead, what happens in these circumstances is surgeons will cool a patient down. They'll cool their body temperature down to 18 degrees Celsius or so. And at these cold temperatures, heart function completely stops, brain activity completely stops, and it looks, for all intents and purposes, like the patient is dead, like they're a corpse. However, there's an operating window of maybe 45 to 60 minutes where they can repair those blood vessels in the patient's brain or their heart, and then once they're done, warm them back up again. And there's very high survival rates even in these circumstances. And when you look at that, when you look at surgeons rewarming an individual who really looks like they're dead, then you have to start to question, well, hold on, what exactly is death?
So you're saying that death is effectively the disintegration of the self, one's memories, etc. Should we therefore be pushing back the idea of clinical death, at least in theory, to 36 hours? After somebody stopped breathing, etc.
Well, the question is there's multiple ideas around death, and there's different questions that have to be asked based on what one is trying to do in a particular circumstance. If you are diagnosing a patient whose body is otherwise failing, and you are looking for markers that unambiguously say somebody is not going to be able to continue living, then you might use something as simple as just their heart has stopped and they're not going to be able to continue on from here. But if you're asking the question of when does someone's personal identity totally disintegrate? When are their memories gone? When are the structures in their brain that encode their personality gone? In the same way that we don't think someone's died when they're under anesthesia, even if their neurons are still intact, or we don't think someone's died when they're in this hypothermic state, even when there's no brain activity at all. I would say that the information in their brain that makes them who they are might be intact for hours, maybe 36 hours after their heart has stopped and brain activity, like electrical brain activity, has stopped. So if that's the definition we're interested in, then yes, I think we should be thinking about pushing back the line of what we count as death.
So what is the brain doing in that period? Let's say it's 12 hours. What's happening between the cessation of breathing, all the processes we associate with death, and those memories still being there, but there's no electrical activity in the brain? Obviously, that's an experiential state which none of us have recovered from, but what's your hypothesis as to what that feels like for the person who's in it?
Well, so I think what we have to distinguish between is what it feels like, so consciousness, and what's happening in the brain.
Yeah.
Because it is the case that people have undergone periods where brain activity has stopped, and then they've been revived, like in the hypothermia surgery cases I was talking about. So if we think about using the stopping of blood flow as our time zero, so after blood flow stops, within a few seconds, someone will lose consciousness because the brain is very energy intensive. Within a couple of minutes, the neurons will lose their ability to control electrical flow, and they will start to run into problems. Prior to then, it's pretty easy to, if you reintroduce blood flow and you reintroduce oxygen to restore someone to consciousness. So after a few minutes, after blood flow stopped, after the neurons run out of energy, things increasingly start to go wrong. And it's lots of things that are going wrong. So, we can go into the technical details, but essentially it's like in the absence of energy, the machinery of the brain cells starts to collapse. Like imagine a complex machine that you've thrown a spanner into, and like there's gears flying off, there's bits of proteins and molecular machinery end up in locations they're not supposed to be in. You get things like increasing acidity levels. There's general breakdown. But that breakdown does take time. And it takes time even in the sense of after, I think the current threshold with which we can revive someone is maybe like 10 to 15 minutes of blood flow having stopped. In that circumstance, quite a bit of brain damage might have occurred during that time, but it's still, to a degree, surmountable. Somebody can come back from this period of unconsciousness and still have a good quality of life thereafter. But after a certain amount of damage has occurred, it becomes impossible, at least with current technology, to restore someone to health. But your question was like, what's that experience like? I would say it's the same as being unconscious for 15 seconds or 5 seconds. Like the individual has long since stopped being conscious.
Yeah. I mean, you use the analogy in the book of effectively a book still exists even if nobody's reading it. The memories are still there, but they're not being engaged with by a thinking self.
Yes.
So they could be revived, but...
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of weird to imagine a distinction between like consciousness, our like stream of experience, and our memories and personality and all those sorts of things. But in other circumstances, it's a little less weird. Like we have all sorts of memories that we're not aware are stored in our brains that then we can pull out, with a particular trigger. For example, I've come here to London from Australia, and I'm wandering around the streets. I've been here the last few days, and I keep seeing a site that I haven't seen for years, and the memory of having previously, visited the Nelson's Column pops back into my head. And like, I wasn't conscious of the fact that I had seen that before. It was stored somewhere in the structure of my brain, but it had to be there somehow, even if I wasn't conscious of it. There's a bit of a tangent, but it's just to point out the difference between being aware of something in the present and the actual structure, memories still being there in your brain.
So what is the self? Is it consciousness or is it memories? You're obviously looking at these as two quite distinctive physical processes.
So ask different philosophers and you will get different answers to what exactly the self is. It's quite a controversial topic in philosophy. But a fairly common definition is that a self is the collection of all of the different attributes that define a particular unique individual. So it's not just your memories, it's not just your personality, it's just not what it feels like to be you in any particular moment, but it's all of those things aggregated together. It's a multiple attributes definition. And that's distinct, that's a definition of the self with respect to, for example, personal identity, or the question of what makes someone the same person at different points in time, when you're 10, 20, 30, 40. You can think about that in quite different terms from what it feels like to be you in a particular moment. In that circumstance, you're asking questions about what does it feel like to be a human, to see with human eyes and to feel with human senses. That's more a question of like the embodied self, what one's body feels like. And this is why it's controversial in philosophy, because depending on how you ask the question, the answer to what exactly the self is different for differently posed questions.
Let me rephrase it then. Identity is tied up more with memories than consciousness.
Yes and no. I mean, insofar as if the way in which we were conscious changed at different points in our lifespan, then I think it would be very important to keep in mind like consciousness as part of being the same self. But insofar as I think people generally still feel, pretty much the same at different points in time, like they experience the world in the same way, then things like the constancy of one's memories and the constancy of one's personality is what's more important of thinking about identity over time.
So, I mean, this book is about effectively the possibility of post-humanism, full brain uploads, the idea of one's self, one's identity being extracted from this physical body and being somewhere else. But if you're saying that the self consists not just in memories, but also in consciousness, is it possible then we can map memories perfectly? We can store memories, but we've still lost the self?
So I think what you're getting at is there possibly a circumstance where we've mapped out someone's memories, we've mapped out their personality, we've uploaded them, we've given them a new robotic body, we've done some sort of strange medical intervention, and we have a circumstance where someone is in a very different body to what they were previously in, even though they've retained their memories and personality. And the question is, are they still the same self? Do they still feel the same way? Are they still conscious in the same way? And the short answer is, we don't really know how consciousness works, so we can't definitively answer that. But as long as they were still using a brain that was analogous to their previous brain, they're probably conscious in the same way that they used to be. And thus, they probably feel the same way that they used to be.
So what you're saying is you can map it, and if you can map something, you can replicate something, but you don't need to know how something works in order for it to work.
Well, the consciousness is a difficult one. Like for other processes, we know that if we maintain the function the same way, then it works in the same way. So you think of something like, you can have the same program work on different computers, or you can do some industrial process in a variety of different ways because you can verify the process is the same. What makes consciousness so hard is like, we feel it only from the inside, our subjective experiences. So we can't like put a scanner on someone's head and say like, oh yes, they're conscious in exactly the same way as that other individual. This is the problem we're having today with like being able to work out if AIs are conscious or not, or being able to work out if other animals are conscious in the same way or not. So definitive proofs are very difficult to have with respect to consciousness. However, if you have something that is like functioning very similarly to some other item, so if you have an uploaded brain that seems to function like it has exact digital equivalence to the neurons from the brain on which it was based, down to the level of like how its individual neurons work or how the branches of its individual neurons work, then that would be a pretty compelling argument for the fact that it would be conscious in the same way as the brain on which it was originally based. Because that's a school of thought known as functionalism, which is that so long as the correct functions are maintained, then it's likely to be conscious in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, and also science is littered with examples of people doing stuff and getting outcomes they're expecting and predicting, but not knowing why that process or causal mechanism works. I mean, a great example is genetic inheritance. We don't really work out how that functions until Mendel in the 19th century, but of course, agricultural society has been doing that for at least 12,000 years, and people knew how to breed in and out certain features. They just didn't know how it functionally worked. So it seems plausible from what you're saying that we could replicate human consciousness without actually knowing precisely why it works the way it does.
Yes, I think that is the case. I mean, it's obviously a very uncomfortable position to be in. It would be much nicer if we knew precisely how it works, and I hope that in time we will discover exactly how it works. But I do think there's a very strong case to be made that so long as you replicate the causal mechanisms well enough, then you would have very strong evidence for reproducing consciousness in a different format.
So cool. So cool. So how far away is this stuff?
So
how far away are we from, full brain uploads?
It's very hard to tell, but I did run a survey recently of a few hundred different neuroscientists trying to ask their opinion on how far away they think this technology is. And their best guess was we could probably emulate a mouse. I'm going to get my exact dates wrong, but I think it's something like in the 2060s, and a human something in like the 2120 or so was their guess. And the reason why I think there's some degree of confidence is we are making steps towards being able to produce these emulations, or I use the term emulation or whole brain emulation because that's the formal term for essentially uploading. We are making steps towards being able to do that. For example, there's some very recently published work on totally mapping out a fly's brain, looking at I think it's 160,000 neurons and all the connections between those neurons. And then not only just having that structural information, but in creating an artificial digital version of that brain, the neuroscientists were able to show that if you stimulated the neurons in that artificial brain that corresponded to those that sense like sugary flavors, the artificial digital brain would try and like stick out its proboscis or stick out its tongue.
Wow.
Now this is a very crude model, and it's not like a full representation of like the full complexity of a human brain. They deliberately created a simplified model. But it shows that if you have the structural information and some idea of how the neurons work, then you can restore some of the functions. And it's precedent for why neuroscientists, or at least a reasonable chunk of neuroscientists, think that the possibilities of whole brain emulation and uploading are actually real at some point in the future.
You said 2120s.
That was their like average guess, yes.
And that would be for our capacity to map the entire brain to 100% precision, or being able to replicate it?
So there's a whole bunch of different factors that would go into this. So there's, I talk about in the book the idea of preserving people's brains. And that I think we can already do with current technology. Then there's the question of, can you actually like...
We can do it to 100% with current technology.
Let me break down the elements. So if you're imagining that you want to create an emulation or an upload of a brain, the steps that you have to take are, first, you need to preserve the brain or in some way be able to like have it in a way that you can scan it. Then you have to do the scanning, the imaging, somehow collect the data on the structure of the brain. Then you have to somehow restore it to function by recreating its individual neurons or allowing them to have activity once again. And those different steps probably have different levels of complexity associated with them. So just preserving brains is relatively simple. I think a combination of chemicals and cold temperatures is enough to do that. And indeed, we, like as neuroscientists, all the time preserve brains for neuroscientific studies. Because if you're going to, like for example, that fly I mentioned before, if you're going to image the structure of a brain, you need to preserve it first. Then there's the question of scanning. And this is something that the technology for is improving very rapidly. At the moment, we can really only do small brains, things like worms and flies. And historically, we've used microscopes like electron microscopes, which go down to nanometer resolution to do that. But if you tried to use those same technologies on a human brain at the moment, it would probably take hundreds or thousands of years to complete the process for a human brain. But people are scaling those technologies up and, in fact, developing new, fancier ways of doing it, which mean that over time it will probably become easier and easier and easier to do the scanning process. Then once you have all the data, you've got a digital image of someone's brain that you're storing on a hard drive or of an animal's brain. There's the question of letting that emulation run or giving it the computing power that it requires to run.
So a quick question, you're saying storage. How much storage would you need for, say, a human brain? How many terabytes are we looking at?
My guess is you'd need about an exabyte, which is, it's 10 to the 18. So I think that's like, what is that? That's a terabyte's 10 to the 12. I'm not going to get this right off the top of my head, but it is equivalent to like a few days worth of internet traffic, I think. So it is like both an unfathomably large number, but also something that we theoretically could store already today on with like a very large amount of computing data storage.
But presumably it would make sense in the distant future to be storing that stuff as DNA, which has already happened, right? We've been able to convert digital data to and from DNA, or you think that ultimately it will remain?
I think that we get better and better at storing it in like digital formats. Right. I think the like density with which we can pack data into digital formats is getting better and better over time. So I'm not a soft.
But my point is, you wouldn't need some technological breakthrough to be able to store an exabyte.
The storage we would be able to do. The hard part actually is both the scanning at the moment, getting through that scanning bottleneck, and then also being able to produce the recreation of digital neurons, being able to understand how it is that neurons function well enough to create the artificial versions of them that can use that scanned data to recreate the brain.
No, this is all perfectly useful. I suppose the point is for people who are thinking, well, my daughter, she was born last year. If she lives 100 years, she might be around for a world where this is the kind of thing we're looking at. But I'm worried. I'm not worried. I'm just thinking about the sort of technological impediments. So what kind of energy intensity would you need? What methods of data storage would you need? And you're saying actually a lot of the stuff's already there.
Yeah. So if we look backwards, I think, and I've got the exact details in the book, but it's something like computing power has increased by 100 million fold in the last 30 years. If that trend holds into the future, my estimate is that you would be able to emulate a human brain by something like the late 2040s or early 2050s. That's just the computing power required. Now, it might take a bit longer, and actually I think the limit is more the scanning part than it is the computing power part. So it might take decades longer than that, which is probably what pushes out people's estimates to 2120s or so. But it doesn't look like there's any definitive engineering bottleneck that is insurmountable at this point in time. It's more just an extrapolation of technology that's already being developed.
So this is something I've thought about for a long time, not in relation to whole brain emulation, but just the mapping on of biological inequality onto economic inequality, which actually you can talk about inequality being awful, etc. But for the majority of human history, it's been potluck, and actually very successful people would die young. That's quite a common thing. Alexander the Great, one example.
Yeah.
But my worry is with a lot of these sort of longevity treatments and what you're talking about here is that you could potentially see a world where the ultra rich, somebody like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, they start to live to 150, 160, or with this kind of technology even further, while median life expectancy stays the same. And of course, that has massive implications for human society, because Elon Musk by 50 can accumulate, $250 billion US. If he lives to 150, what kind of wealth can you accumulate? What kind of inequality do you see as a result? So it becomes almost this Ouroboros. Economic inequality becomes biological inequality, which creates further economic inequality. What's your read on that? Do you think that if this technology becomes quasi-mainstream a century from now, is that a major consideration, sort of the rights of access to this kind of stuff?
My view is that we should be trying to make this sort of technology in the same way as we do with all medical technology, available as cheaply as possible to as many people as possible. So I mentioned earlier on Elizabeth Hughes, who was one of the first people to be treated with insulin. At the time, it was incredibly hard to access, and she was very lucky to have a father, I think, who was a former vice president of the United States, which helped her be connected and able to access these things. But nowadays, insulin is extremely cheap. It's readily available in almost everywhere in the entire world. And this is the general path we see for all sorts of medical technologies, where they start off very complicated and expensive, and then they gradually become more and more widely available. And so my view and my hope is that with brain preservation and ultimately with things like uploading, that they would become widely and readily available to all. And the great thing, I think, about preservation is it shouldn't be that expensive to do. It's not a fundamentally very complicated procedure or very expensive procedure. So we could be readily and widely delivering preservation to people. And the great thing then is that if they're preserved, you're able to hold on to an individual until such time as the cost to revive them becomes cheap enough to provide en masse. So I don't think there's a tension between using and pursuing these technologies and exacerbating inequality of access to medical technology.
Yeah, you talk in the book about, again, it's a literary device. It's an amazing literary device, I think, about creating a time machine and being able to send people into the future, which is effectively what this is. But I suppose an analog would be that, the first automobiles that we get, Daimler, I think, end of the 19th century, it's not until really 1945. It's a mass commercial technology. You might even say the 30s. So there is this window of, let's say, 20 to 30 years of only the ultra-rich being able to access cars. And so I suppose there is an ethical question there that for potentially a couple of decades at least, only the ultra-rich will be afforded that luxury of potentially infinite lifespan.
Yeah, so...
And that's a really big moral quandary, isn't it?
Yes, but I think it's addressable. So there's the question of... And the odd thing about brain preservation and revival, as opposed to other medical technology, is that it's a two-part technology. What I argue for in the book is that although we can't revive people from a preserved state today, we can be preserving them relatively affordably today, and we could be providing this society-wide today. So what that would result in, if this is something as a society we actually picked up on, would be a world in which everyone who was dying and chose to make use of the technology could be preserved. But then we'd eventually get to a point where, although we had all these people who were preserved, the revival part of it was only just becoming available and was very expensive. Then you'd be seeing a situation where, yes, perhaps you would have this issue of, we have all these preserved people, but only the ultra wealthy can afford the revival at this point in time. But I guess the question would be for our descendants at that time point to decide, should we just start to revive the ultra wealthy already? Or should we hold off on revivals until, it becomes cheap enough that we can provide it en masse to everyone? It's a social problem that has to be worked out at some point. But I don't think it's an argument for not providing preservation to people in the present.
And you make this really strong progressive argument, which is, I think that's probably the deal breaker for me, which is that young people tend to be more interested in climate change, for instance, because they have a vested interest in the welfare of the planet 50, 60, 70 years from now. They'll be there to experience it. And it probably would be a massive psychological shift for people who have, one might argue, a predatory relationship to the planet or to resources or to other human beings via exploitation, that if they could be revived, if they were going to live 100 years from now, they would have quite a deep investment actually in the planet not being 4 or 5 degrees warmer than it is today.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this different to the question of what would we do if we discovered a pill that stopped aging, but it cost $1 million per pill or something, where in that circumstance, it would be much more salient, the trade-off between the expense and the inequality. In this circumstance, because we can preserve people today, but we can't revive people today, there's this enforced waiting period, essentially, where somebody who is considering using this has to acknowledge the fact that it will be future descendants who will be the ones reviving them, and they will be under the care of those future generations if they are to be revived. And what I think that means is that when you think about being in that situation and thinking about how, your travel through the time machine or your revival is dependent on the goodwill of generations to come, I think that really focuses the mind on I must ensure that those people look back on me favorably.
How to be a good ancestor.
Yeah, to be a good ancestor, because now you have a very personal stake in the future.
Yeah, something conservatives talk about a lot, and I've often thought about this. If you're political, you believe in a set of broader connections to other people beyond yourselves. Now, historically on the left, that tends to be chronologically distinct, and it's in real time, and you're connected to the wider world around you. And of course, for conservatives, it's longitudinal. You're connected to the past, but also the future. I've been blessed with these things, and it's my obligation to hand them on to the people who come after me. And it seems to me that this is just such a profound challenge to the conservative mindset in a way, but it's also incredibly relevant, because the idea of being a good ancestor becomes so vivid. There's a good book have you met the gentleman, Roman Krasnarich? Yeah,
I have not met him, but I have read his book.
It's a great book.
Yes.
And, he talks about that period of time that you should care about politically really goes back to your grandparents, to your grandchildren, which given, current human life expectancy is 150 to 200 years. And that's the expanse in which you should think about yourself as a political moral being. But this makes that 500 years, 600 years.
Yeah. I mean, I just think in general, we need to be taking the long view. And I think I agree with Roman and others that even if brain preservation doesn't work, if life extension technologies don't work, we have an obligation to ensure that the future goes well for future generations to come. But particularly if you have a personal stake, I think that becomes very, very salient, that there really will be a 2100, a 2200, a 2300, and perhaps that will be a world that's disfigured by climate change or nuclear war or poverty and inequality, or perhaps it will be one that goes well, and that's in the same way that, far fewer people die in infancy today, that we are making strides in reducing the degree to which we pollute the environment. Perhaps if we really get our act together and we work well, we could develop a better world in 2100 or 2200.
At the start, we talked about this present cultural moment being one about, negativity and cynicism. What do you think of the birth strike movement? This idea that to save the planet, we shouldn't have children. We're bringing children into a uniquely awful world. I mean, I personally find that quite incoherent. The world was certainly worse to bring children into 150 years ago than it is today. Where do you stand on that kind of stuff? On why there is this... Clearly, there's this impulse amongst younger people to think that the future is a complete write-off.
Yeah, I think it is, I would agree, a little ahistorical to be saying that we are in a uniquely bad circumstance for children today. I think it's also a bit odd in that it looks like, as the current trajectories are going, that world population will peak at around 2100 and then start to decline even without encouraging birth strike movements. I think the issues of today are less due to we have too many people that are causing too much resource consumption just because we have too many people, and more around how do we manage resources, how do we ensure that there's equity of access to resources, and that we are pursuing economic development in a responsible way. And I think there are trade-offs to be made, but those trade-offs can be made without requiring us to have fewer children.
And what would you say to somebody who thinks, well, you're being so deeply irresponsible? I think, 125 billion people have lived in the history of humanity, something like that?
Yeah, it depends on exactly where you draw the line for our ancestors, but yes, something
so
like
let's say this technology works, and let's say, we go back forward 500-600 years, all of a sudden you've got a planet of 50-60 billion people potentially, obviously depending on birth rates. Where are they all going to live?
I mean, that depends on exactly the format in which they live. So if we're anticipating that in the future... actually, even before I get into that, let's take one pause for a moment. So again, what I'm suggesting is not a technology that just extends people's lifespans as we naturally think of them. You go 80, 90, 100, 110. It requires this period of preservation. And what that means is when people are preserved, when their bodies are preserved, and they're in this limbo stasis state, they're not really consuming very many resources at all. They're just taking up space in a warehouse or something. So if you have a world in which, there's not enough resources to pursue revival at that point in time, you can just leave them in stasis. But then when revival technologies become available, as I think they will, then the question of what do we do with all of these people becomes relevant. So if you're imagining reviving people in a traditional biological sense, restoring their bodies to health, and you have this issue of you have 50, 60, 80 billion people, there's the question of where and how would they live? Now, I would point out that I think it's only something like 1% of global land is currently built up. And we've gone from a world where there were, I think a few thousand years ago, maybe only 1 million people around, to one where there's almost 10 billion people today. So it could be the case that we can, with improved agricultural developments and improved good stewardship of the planet, have a lot more people than who are currently around living on the same amount of land. But I think if we're looking to the future, we can be a little bit more optimistic about things like maybe they'd be able to live in space or on Mars or in other formats that they don't currently live in. Because as much as our cities and skyscrapers look wild today, I imagine the future ways of living will look wild to us nowadays. But that's even to put aside the weirdness of, the possibility of emulations and uploading and living in a digital format altogether. So the short answer is, I'm not exactly sure how people in the future will live. I think that is something that will be worked out as time goes on. But the beauty of preservation is it gives us the time to sort that out.
There's this wonderful excerpt, page 249. You speculate about what that future might look like. 2124. Economic reforms of the late 21st century ensured that the enormous dividends provided by cheap energy and labour automation were shared population-wide, allowing global living standards to rise dramatically. The average Bangladeshi is now far wealthier than essentially all Americans were a century prior, that's today. While there is still social conflict, scarcity is as distant a memory as smallpox was to those of the 2020s. There is even enough surplus wealth available to allow government and private budgets to fund increasingly ambitious projects. The Diverse Futures Consortium has already achieved 47% of its goal of returning Earth's biological, cultural, and linguistic diversity to its pre- agricultural levels. This is the exciting bit, Ariel. Mars colonization efforts have begun in earnest, with the red planet now boasting a permanent population of 1 million settlers. And amidst those flourishing ventures, motivated by goodwill for those past generations who ushered in this era of peace and prosperity, the Ancestor Revival Project has just transitioned from its pilot phase to full operations. Now, the vivid nature with which you describe that does suggest to me that is what you'd like to see.
Yeah, I mean, I deliberately used a variety of different examples of what sort of positive futures people might like to see. So you have some people, I think more on the left, who would like to provide more autonomy to all sorts of different groups to pursue things like ensuring languages don't go extinct, or ensuring that many different cultures can flourish as well as they possibly can. On the other hand, you have other visions, people like Elon Musk, of settling Mars and grand technological developments occurring. And I think that there are many flourishing futures that can live side by side comfortably with each other, so long as we ensure that we don't have things like environmental degradation or other global conflicts. And the point of a good future, as I see it, is just being able to provide to people as many possibilities as possible. That's what we've seen historically, where we've gone from a world full of poverty, where people didn't have the resources to pursue their goals and dreams, to one in which a greater and greater share of the world's population is able to increasingly pursue their goals. And I think what I would like to achieve with preservation and revival and the prospect of abolishing death is to achieve a world in which everyone is capable of having the resources to pursue their goals and dreams for as long as they desire.
We're getting towards the end of the interview. I suppose lots of people watching this or listening to this will be thinking, this is crazy. I want to die. I don't want to live forever. What would you say to them?
I would say that although that's a possibility that people may feel when they're a little bit more distant from death, that is not what most people who are approaching death actually think. So if you survey people on how long they'd like to live, most people say about 10 years or so longer than they're statistically likely to get. So in a country like the UK, I'd imagine most people would say something like 90 years of age. But the older people get, the more they bump that number up. And specifically, if you survey those who are unfortunately are terminally ill at death's door, and you ask them, what is your will to live? Like, do you continue to have a strong will to live? What you will find is that something like 70% of patients who are imminently dying will still report a very high will to live. And particularly, those who have reduced will to live are generally those who are suffering from very bad nausea and from very bad pain. And if they have those symptoms alleviated, will go back to saying that they have a strong will to live. And I think that's because, when you're in your 30s and hopefully healthy, it's easy to be like, oh yes, one day I'll be finished with life and ready to pass on. But I think that actually, when that becomes a more salient question, most people feel that actually they would like to continue spending time with their friends and family. They would like to continue to pursue their goals. They would like to continue to enjoy time in the sun. So my guess is that that's more a feeling that we have to protect ourselves from our fear of mortality than it is one that is genuinely held by most people who are approaching their deaths.
It's cope.
I think it's cope.
It's cope. And I suppose, you can even look at Greek mythology, and the argument there is that the gods are jealous of humans because we are mortal. And so the things we do are captured in time, and they are, they go, wow, this is so valuable precisely because it doesn't last particularly long.
Yeah.
You think that presumably is just a cultural expression of that tendency
of
cope.
I do. I mean, I think what I'm proposing sounds very bizarre and very unnatural and very weird. But I think that if you frame it as, imagine you are having a nice day. You've had a lovely day with your friends and family. You've gone to some music event. You've had an ice cream. You're sitting around in the sun. And you're asked, would you like to do that again tomorrow? I think very few people would say, I'd never like to do that again, actually. I'm finished. I think it's the case that if we could ensure people lived in good health, not in pain, but were able to keep doing the things they wanted to do and live their life in a way that they wanted to, I think the vast majority of people would say, I would like to keep going indefinitely. Now, maybe it's the case that after 500 years, people would eventually tire, and I don't think they should be restricted from making that choice at some point if they want to. But I think saying people are comfortable with the 80 years they're currently slated to get is cope. And we talked about how earlier on, things like Huntington's disease were probably less tragic because people lived shorter lifespans. And I think it becomes really obvious that it's cope because if we imagine going back to the lifespans our ancestors used to have, I think people would be very unhappy about that proposal.
I quite fancy 200 years myself. I think beyond that, are you familiar with the short story by Borges, The Immortal?
I've not actually read it.
I've lived long enough to learn everything and to forget everything. And I suppose that's the point. I suppose there must be diminishing returns after a certain point that, how many languages can you learn before you start to forget the ones you'd previously learned? How many places can you visit before you start to forget?
I suppose it's for each to decide what makes their life meaningful and worth living. I mean, for some people, it would just be, hedonic pleasures, like going to the football match again or eating an ice cream again or seeing a concert again. And I think for a lot of people, that would probably be sufficient insofar as I think most people don't get bored of like, oh, well, there was already the football on last year, so I don't need to watch it again this year. But in terms of like people who are more motivated by pursuing ambitious goals or projects, I don't think we're ever, as individuals or species, likely to run out of these ambitious goals or projects, whether it's coming up with new engineering feats or whether it's colonizing the stars. Like maybe after 200 years, but maybe, you'd reach 200 years and you'd be like, I've still got so many podcasts to do, books to read, projects to pursue. Maybe not podcasts. Maybe you'd move on from then, but I'm not sure.
Are you familiar with the argument that basically we have very high rates of divorce now because people aren't meant to be alive for so long with a single life partner? Have you encountered that?
I have not.
I mean, people say, we will be together forever. But the idea of being married to somebody for several hundred years does strike me as we might have to change that social institution.
I mean, yeah, I think there are probably quite a number of things that would have to be revived. Sorry, that's a salient Freudian slip. Would have to be revised if we live that long. And I do think it would present new difficulties, new social difficulties, new cultural difficulties. But I think those sets of problems would be far preferable to the current set of problems we have, which is just that people don't have any choices. They sicken and die and reach the end of their stories. I'd much sooner have to work out how to keep my relationship going with my wife when we're 150 than just have it end when we're in our 70s or 80s or 90s.
I think my wife would definitely get rid of me before then. Ariel, it's been a pleasure. This book is absolutely fantastic. So much food for thought. Thanks for coming on Downstream.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.